So we've returned from a 2-month cross-country journey. We canoed the Yukon River, albeit in modern canoes and clothing. And I'm finally back into my 18th century mode. And well, for 3 years now, I've kind of immersed myself into the culture of that time period. But now we're back home, and I'm back in the proper clothing, and I'm in a proper canoe instead of carbon fiber at birch bark. The moose season's fast approaching. We're going to get out and do some scouting about to see where we're going to hunt for both deer and moose. And I've had a lifelong passion for canoeing, and I'm going to tell a wee bit of history this morning about the man who instilled that in me, and I'm sure it'll be with me for the rest of my life. There are three men that have had a significant influence on my life. First and foremost, my father, a 5-year veteran of World War II. He saw service in Belgium, France, Holland. The next one, and probably the reason I have this passion for 18th century, was my grade 10 history teacher. And the day we met him, he jumps up on his desk. He's wearing a trench coat, a derby hat, and a big cigar. And he starts quoting Winston Churchill. And then the man who I'm going to tell my wee bit of history about today is Archibald Stanfield Belaney, born September 18th, 1888 in Hastings, England. Now, Archie doesn't have a very happy child life. His father abandons him. He's raised by two very stern, proper English aunts. And but he has this passion for Native American culture. And he builds little teepees, and he's got little figurines in his room. He reads everything he can possibly get on that culture. But Archie also is very intelligent. He excels at languages. He excels at grammar. He loves to write. And at the age of 17, he makes his way across the big pond there and arrives in Toronto, Ontario, quickly makes his way up to the Temagami region, where he immerses himself in the native culture. And the Ojibwe people in that area, they welcome him with open arms, because they kind of think, this is pretty neat, this curious Englishman wants to live like a native. And we're talking the early 1800s, or early 1900s. Because he's so good at languages, he very quickly learns the Ojibwe language, which is a very hard language to learn, or so I've been told. And he fabricates a story. Now, he has no intent he doesn't know what his future is going to be, but he fabricates a story that he was born of a Scots father who had immigrated to America, married an Apache woman, so he had native blood in him, which he didn't. He was pure English. And that's where the story of Grey Owl starts. And to show you the influence he had on me, the natives gave him the name Washaquanason, which means he who flies by night, and hence Grey Owl translated into the English tongue. So I read everything I could read that he produced at a very young age, 12, 13, 14. His writing is so descriptive that when he describes a sunset or a canoe shooting down through a set of rapids, you're there. You're actually doing it. He's so descriptive in his writing. So I start saving my pennies from my allowance for my first canoe. And it takes me a couple of years. And at age 14, I've got enough saved to order a canoe from Sears Roebuck. And then the long wait for it to arrive takes place. And I finally get this fiberglass canoe, which was a real tank. It was tippy, heavier than a dead man, but I love that canoe. And I loved it so much, and the man so much, that inspired it, that I painted Washaquanason on the bow of it on both sides. And that started, as I mentioned earlier, my lifelong passion in canoeing. So how does Gray Owl become, or how does Archie Belaney become the famous Gray Owl? So, was Archie Belaney, actually I'm going to use Gray Owl from here on in, was Gray Owl Canada's greatest conservationist, or was he as Canada's greatest fraud? And one can look at where this evolves, or his life evolves, is, and today we'd call it cultural expropriation. But was it really? I personally believe that he had no intent to defraud people. He simply wanted to be accepted. Just like I want to immerse myself into 18th century culture, which I try to do on a daily basis, Archie desperately wanted to be native. So by now he's lost his British accent, and in 1910 he has a native wedding, but he's married to an Angeli, and he fathers a child which they name Agnes, a daughter named Agnes, and Archie, not having the role model of a perfect family, his father had abandoned him. Well, one year in, Archie abandons Angeli, and he makes his way to a small town in northern Ontario called Biscotasing. And I've canoed through that area, and it's absolutely a beautiful area. He quickly develops a reputation as a hard drinker, someone you don't mess with. He's an exceptional knife thrower. And he gambles and he makes money by throwing knives and what have you. He supports himself in the summer by working as a forest ranger. They would send brigades out into the different districts to watch for fire. In the wintertime, he starts his own trap line because he's learned well from the natives. And yeah, he's now more native than white person. His hair is in the middle of his back. It's jet black. In fact, he used to dye it to make sure that he could look more native than white. So now Archie, we're going to fast forward a bit here to 1915. He falls in love again with a Marie Gerard, and true to his nature, he leaves her. And unbeknownst to him, she's pregnant. Now, she dies very shortly after giving birth to their son John in 1915. Now, World War I's broken out, so Archie signs up. Archie makes his way over. His long black hair's cut to military standards. They think he's native. The people in his company think he's native. And they give him the job of a sniper because he's a deadly good marksman. He gets wounded in the left foot. Now, and this wound is going to bother him for the rest of his life. But if, lo and behold, if he doesn't make his way to a military hospital in Hastings, England, which is where he was born, and he falls in love with another woman, Ivy Holmes, and with the blessing of his two old stern aunts, because this is a proper British lady, I think she's in theater, quite renowned, they marry. Now, at that time, British soldiers or Canadian soldiers that are being shipped back home can't take their brides with them if they happened to have married during the war. So on September the 17th, 1917, Archie makes his way back across the ocean to Canada, back to his life. And Ivy knows what his life's like, and she fully expects him to bring her over. Well, she never sees him again. I can conclude that part of the story with a few years later she finds out, well, he's already married. So she sues for a divorce on the basis of bigamy. She's granted it, and that's the end of that relationship. And now Archie is back in his normal environment. He's back doing the forest ranger thing in the summer and trapping in the winter. And this is where Archie's life takes a major turn. So 1925 finds Gray Owl working as a guide for an outfitter in the Temagami region. And by chance he meets a Gertrude Bernard, quite a few years younger than him, I believe 20 years younger. She's a full-blooded Iroquois. They fall in love. So Archie's relationship with women's continue, but this relationship's real. I truly believe that this is the one woman that Archie truly loved, and she's the person that's going to change his life. Now, they spend that winter trapping on this trap line. Gray Owl is teaching her. She grew up in an urban environment. She didn't really know her own culture, so she's quite anxious to learn it all. And Gray Owl gives her the name of Anahiro, and she's participating in the trapping, but she doesn't think much of it. And in the spring, Archie kills a beaver, and then as they're leaving with the carcass in the canoe, they hear this crying, and there's two little kits. Well, Archie takes out his tomahawk, and he's going to go back and dispatch them because they can't live without a mother. And Anahiro, she opposes this. She doesn't have no part of it. She says, "We'll adopt them." And reluctantly, Archie does. And that's the change, because what's happening not only in Ontario and parts of Canada, but in the western states, anywhere where beaver exists, they're almost extinct, like literally on the verge of extinction. And we know now that's not the case in our modern world. There's beaver everywhere, and that can be attributed to one man and one man only, and that would be Gray Owl. So here we have this hardened trapper, killer of animals, hard drinking fellow that's got two little baby cats that he's adopted. And they're bottle feeding them. And there's pictures of Archie, holding little kit in his hand with the bottle and what have you. And his whole life's changed now. And he realizes he has to make a difference, but he's not sure how to do it. And at this point, Anahiro, she convinces Archie that he can do it through his writing. He's a gifted writer, as we know from his early education. So he starts writing articles. Now, the articles are gobbled up quicker than Archie can scribe them down on paper. So they decide at this point that maybe a book's in order. Now, before we get into that, Archie gets a job in the height of the Depression. So Archie's hired as one of the first conservation officers in Canada. And they locate him at Riding Mountain National Park in Manitoba. It's a poor site. Its waters aren't deep enough or clean enough. So they relocate him to Prince Albert National Park on the beautiful shores of Lake Ajuan. Now, Kathy and I a few years ago canoed into that. We were actually going to canoe into it again on this trip, but time didn't allow it. But we canoed into Archie's cabin. I've sat at the very table that the man wrote. He's buried there. I took an offering of tobacco and sprinkled it on his grave. Because of my love of the man, it was quite a moving experience for me. And in hindsight, I wish we'd taken the time and done it a second time. But so now Archie's writing, and he writes his first book in that very cabin. And it's called Pilgrims of the Wild, and it's published in 1934, becomes a bestseller worldwide. Very quickly after Gray Owl writes Pilgrims of the Wild, he writes a book called The Adventures of Sajo and Her Beaver People. It's a children's book. And I highly encourage you to read it to your children. It's a phenomenal book, or if they're old enough to read it themselves. Late 34, early 35 finds Archie in England on a lecture tour. Not only is he a phenomenal writer, but he's an amazing orator. And his overriding theme is, remember, nature doesn't belong to you, you belong to it. And that was sort of his theme. He carried that through in all his lectures. He returns back to Canada, and to show how popular he is, in Toronto at one lecture, they turned away over 500 people to hear him speak. So now he's back at Lake Ajuan, and he's writing his next book, The Men of the Last Frontier, also a good book. But I must say, my favorite is Tales of an Empty Cabin, which would become his last book. Now he falls in love, for Archie, he falls in love again. And he marries a woman, and I'm sorry, I can't remember her name right off the bat, but she accompanies Archie when he does his next tour to England. And in that tour to England, he actually performs to the King of England. And it said at the end of it, he goes up and he's going to have a few words with the king. And Archie just reaches out, takes the king's hand, and give it a shake. Now that's something you don't do. You don't touch royalty, apparently. And I'm pretty sure Archie kind of did it, not in spite, but there's a lot of animosity towards, let's say, colonization and monarchy of England, you know, taking all the lands away from the indigenous peoples. But Archie makes his way back. Now, I should point out, before Archie marries the other one, the reason he has a falling out with Anahiro is, remember the age difference here. He's drinking hard, he's writing hard, but he's also drinking hard. She's stuck at Lake Ajuan, and she gets tired of it all. She wants a life of her own. So her and her daughter leave Archie, and that's when he falls in love with this fourth woman in his life. But so that's what it cost Archie. Probably the true love of his life was Anahiro. When he returns back from England on the second tour, he does a major North American tour. It lasts about 4 months, giving hundreds of lectures. He arrives back at Lake Ajuan with a mild case of pneumonia. Within a couple of days, he's declining rapidly. They airlift him out and take him to a hospital, and he succumbs to the pneumonia. The man that inspired my passion for the outdoors and canoeing dies April the 13th, 1938. And regardless, I mean, and at that point, this bombshell hits the world that Grey Owl's a fraud. Regardless of what you may think of him, he was one of Canada's, if not the most important conservationists Canada ever had, or the world. He was a great spokesman for Indigenous people. He literally brought the beaver back from extinction, and an awareness to people about the need to be caretakers of the land. So, yeah, I personally, he was no fraud in my book. He was just a man that wanted to be what he become. And I think I'm going to go out and hand paint Washaquenassin on my birch bark canoe.